All right, let's talk about Starship a little bit. We've been sneaking up to it from a bunch of different directions. Can you just say um, what is Starship and what is the most impressive thing to you about it? I mean, you've talked about the sort of the engines involved. Maybe you haven't really. You're kind of like dancing around it, but because this is such a crucial thing in terms of the next few years, in terms of your own life personally, and also just human civilization reaching out to the stars. It seems like Starship is a really important vehicle to making that happen. So, what is this thing that we're talking about?
Yeah, so Starship is currently in development, the world's largest, most powerful rocket ever built, fully reusable rocket, two-stage rocket. So the booster is landed, and all this is currently aspirational until it's working. So I'll say what it's aspirationally going to be, and obviously I have faith that will happen, but just factually. So the booster will be reused, landed and refueled and reused. The upper stage will be landed, refueled, and reused, and ideally rapidly. In the sense, not talking about months or weeks of refurbishment, but literally talking about like mild inspections, and ideally like under 24-hour reuse. Where you literally land it and fly it like an airplane. So it utilizes liquid methane and liquid oxygen as its propellants. It utilizes the current iterations of it are 33 Raptor engines on the booster and 6 Raptors on the second stage. So there'll be 3 that are vacuum optimized and 3 that are sea level optimized on the upper stage. That are they'll be used, I think, at stage separation anyway. In space, but their main reason that they use them is so they can use them for landing too. The 3 sea level engines to be able to propulsively land the upper stage as well.
So the 3 Raptor engines are the ones that generate the thrust that makes it the most powerful rocket ever built
by almost double
compared to the Saturn V. Really?
The N1 had 45 meganewtons of thrust. The Saturn V had, I think, 35 or 40 meganewtons of thrust. And this has 75 meganewtons. So we're talking almost double. It's a lot of power.
That could be the sexiest thing I've ever heard. Okay. So what are the different testing that's happening? So like what's a static fire with some of these Raptors look like, and where do we stand? You're just talking about offline, like the thing that happened yesterday.
Yeah.
That was impressive.
Everything in this is kind of iterations. And so, the milestones that we're seeing, we actually have on everydayastronaut.com, we have a milestone checklist of like all the things we're hoping to see that we kind of need to see before the first orbital flight of this rocket. So a big milestone that got checked off yesterday was a wet dress rehearsal. So it's literally like fueling the rocket up, getting ready to do everything but lighting the engines, basically. So we're talking about loading it with propellant all the way. And this is the first time. Yep, right there.
Where's the milestones?
Right there at the top. Click that big picture. Yep, just anywhere. That big picture. Yep.
So there's the wet dress rehearsal. So what's the wet dress rehearsal?
Yep. So that's where they, for the first time, they filled it completely to the brim with both liquid oxygen and liquid methane. Now they'd done component level testing where they fill it with liquid nitrogen, which is, it's an inert gas. So it's not like, say it leaks out, it's not going to explode. You could just have a big giant pool of liquid nitrogen like flooding the area, but it's not going to be an explosion. So they've done that for cryo testing to make sure all the components and stuff can handle, being at cryogenic temperatures. It's kind of a good analog before you start putting your fuel and your oxidizer in there. But now, as of yesterday, they fully fueled the rocket with propellant, both stages, the first stage and the second stage, while fully stacked on the pad. Like basically, I mean, it was the first sense we really got of like, this is what it's going to look like right before it takes off. Kind of breathing, coming to life for the first time.
What does the pad look like? So there's a few interesting aspects to this. What's up with the chopsticks and the all of that?
Yeah, so the launch pad is unique. I've never seen anything like it in the prior history of space flight. But it's a really simple launch stand. They basically have like this, it almost looks like a stool, like a milking a cow stool thing with a big giant.
Now
frame.
I know you're from Iowa, but yeah. Yes, we all know what that stool looks like.
We all been sitting on that stool milking cows.
Yeah. Been
with
there, done that.
a with a giant hole in the middle, and that hole in the middle of that stool is where the rocket sits, and it sits on these launch clamps. And then next to it is so that's the orbital launch mount, and then next to it, or the OLM, some people will say, next to it is the orbital launch tower, or the OLT, and that is not only integral to fueling up the upper stage. The upper stage has to have propellant lines run to it so that they can fill it with propellant and all that. But it also, they ended up making it so instead of having a big crane on site to stack the two on top of each other, they literally just use that tower as a crane. So the crane has these giant arms, lovingly called the chopsticks, or the whole system can be called Mechazilla. And that will grab onto, first it'll grab onto the booster, pick it up off of its transporter that transports it from the production site, lifts it up, puts it down onto the launch mount, and then it will pick up the second stage or the upper stage Starship and plop it down on top of the booster. And they did that for the first time last year. Actually, I think it was like Valentine's last year was the first time they used the chopsticks to stack it. And now they're doing it quite frequently, But ultimately, those chopsticks have to serve a second purpose. They're actually going to utilize, if you say it's not so much they're going to catch the booster with these chopsticks. It's not like it's, a dad trying to catch a falling child, It's more that the booster and the Starship will someday land on those arms.
Yeah.
So they're more or less stationary. I'm sure there's some bit of, adjustment that the arms will do, but more or less the rocket's going to propulsively land and get picked up by what's essentially like two relatively small ball joints that hold the entire thing. And so it has to land very precisely on these mounts, then onto the launch mount. And then that's what's going to just place it back onto the stand and allow it to be refueled and fly again.
What's the idea of using the arms versus having a launch pad to land on? What's the benefit?
You are basically removing the mass of what would be heavy landing legs, and you're putting kind of that landing infrastructure onto a ground system. So you're not having to carry those landing legs into orbit.
But it's also elevated off the ground. Is there some aspect to that where you don't have to balance the thrust and all the...
You can negate some of those, there's plume interactions. There's the exhaust hitting concrete, and especially with a rocket this big, it's going to, use 3 Raptor engines firing. If you have them firing really close to the ground, you're just going to absolutely destroy and crater the ground, and you're going to have to refurbish the ground and the landing pad every time, and or have huge landing legs that are super long and tall, to make it so it's elevated enough to not do that. So yeah, you're avoiding that whole mess by catching it high enough off the ground that you don't have to factor that in.
And that's how many engines are involved in the landing part, is the 3 Raptor engines?
Well, we haven't actually, we haven't to date seen the exact landing sequence. So it might be something like at first they might light up, 7 or something, or 9 or something, some number to accelerate quickly or decelerate quickly. Same thing. And then shut it down to 3 or something for a little bit more granular control. Because unlike Falcon 9, Starship has enough engines and variability to actually, if it needed to hover, to maybe more precisely align itself with the pad, it would have that capability. And especially having multiple engines, if you only have a single engine running, you can't really roll. Your roll axis, you can do pitch and yaw because the engine is kind of like a rudder. It can move in 2 axes, so you can easily pitch and yaw the vehicle. But to actually induce roll along its vertical axis, you would either need auxiliary engines to roll it, or you'd need a pair of engines so they can be opposed and induce roll. So by having 2 or 3 running, they have all 3 axes of control that they would need, kind of like a broomstick, and balancing a broomstick on your hand. They can just move it over, and if they need to align it to those landing nubs, on the landing arms and stuff like that, then they can do that.
Speaking of pitch and yaw, the thing, so Starship flips on its belly flops, does a interesting kind of maneuver on the way down to land. Can you describe that maneuver? What's involved with that?
Yeah, so this is definitely a first. I don't think anything's tried landing like this before, but the idea is when you're falling through the atmosphere could actually do a lot of work for you. You're moving quickly, something is falling from space. There's a lot of energy involved.
You have a really good video on this as well.
And thank you. As it's falling, you want to let the atmosphere do as much work as it can. And so if you have a unsymmetric, it's not a ball that's falling. This is some kind of object with shape. Some, at one face of it is going to have more surface area than the other face. So, in the shape of like a cylinder, if you're falling, like a soda can, if you're falling top or bottom first, it's a certain amount of surface area. If you flip that on its side, you actually have a lot more surface area. So with the same exact vehicle, you can actually have a lot more drag. You can actually slow it down a lot more using the exact same atmosphere, same vehicle. Just by turning it 90 degrees, you can slow it down substantially, like 3 or 4 times slower. So that's energy that you don't have to use anywhere else. You don't have to use an engine to slow you down. You don't have to do anything else. So SpaceX realized, okay, if we flip this thing on its side and let it fall like a skydiver almost, instead of like pencil diving into the pool, you're belly flopping. You're maximizing the amount of surface area that's in the wind stream that's being slowed down. But obviously, like, in order to land, especially if you're SpaceX and, Elon's obsessed with like not having different parts, he wants the best part is no part. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to land with the engines, you might as well use engines that you've already have, the engines that are, used for the other portions of flight. So you kick those on and you use those engines to actually turn it 90 degrees from belly flopping to feet first. And that way you can use those same engines to land, and you don't have to have like auxiliary landing engines. You don't have to have forces, even if you were to land like on its belly with a separate set of engines, not only would those engines weigh a lot, and be extra complexity, et cetera, but you also don't have to make the ship be able to handle landing, like on its belly, as opposed to having the forces be vertical through it.
But it's a giant thing. You have to rotate in the air.
Huge.
And as you also highlight, there's liquid fuel slushing around in the tank. So like you can't, I guess, use that fuel directly. You have to have another kind of fuel. Like there's just complexities there that are involved. Plus the actual maneuver is difficult from the like what are the thrusters that actually make that make all of that happen? You're adding a lot of complexity, not a lot, but your complexity to the maneuver and possibility where failure could happen in order to sort of save, in order for the air to do some of the work. So what is some of that complexity? Just you can linger on it.
If you think about what it's going to take to go from horizontal to vertical. This rocket in particular, Starship, has these big flaps. So it has kind of 2 nose flaps and 2 rearward flaps. The rearward flaps are a lot bigger because the majority of the mass, the engines and stuff, are in the back of the vehicle. So in order to kind of be stable, and they just fold themselves inwards, like on their dihedral angle, at a dihedral angle, in order to increase or decrease the drag. So you can control all 3 axes of control while it's falling on its belly. You can control it that way using these 4 different fins. So you have these giant moving surfaces that take thousands of horsepower, just insane amount of torque in order to move these quickly enough to be a valid control surface. Mm. So that's a huge complication, is moving these fins and developing that landing algorithm and the control for a huge vehicle with flaps going like, in and out, in and out, in and out to stay stable. Then right as you light the engines, now all of a sudden you want the top, you want to flip the rocket 90 degrees. So the rearward flaps, the bottom flaps, fold in. They tuck all the way in to minimize drag. That's going to make it want to, swing down. You extend the upper flaps. That makes it so the nose wants to pitch up. You kick on the engines. They're now lighting all 3 engines, at least as of the last successful attempts. They light all 3 of the sea level Raptor engines, and they're pitched all the way 10 or 15 degrees or whatever the maximum pitch is on them. And that induces, it does that kick maneuver to kick it over from horizontal to vertical. Now, the problem is you lit your engines while you're horizontal. So they put some horizontal velocity into the rocket. They push the rocket, at the time the nose is, at the time of lighting those engines, the nose is facing the horizon and the engines are facing the opposite horizon. Yeah. So you now shot it a decent amount in an off, the direction that you're not falling, So you have to factor that in to where you're landing, because you're going to land on this precise, in this case, you're going to land on the inside the loving arms of the chopsticks, the Creed arms wide open, try to land inside those.
Exactly the song that you're playing through my head as I watch this now. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for forever joining those 2. I appreciate this.
And you have to very precisely control. So what you have to do is, now that it's done that kick, you also have to cancel out that horizontal velocity. So it's actually going to rotate beyond 90 degrees to cancel out that horizontal velocity and then modulate the engines to make it so the thrust, is perfect so that it can control itself into a controlled landing. And all this is done in like 500 meters, like 1,500 feet. You're doing all of those things stupidly close to the ground. It looks absurd. So far, they've done 5 of these tests. All the first 4 all blew up. They're all coming in from about 10 kilometers or 33,000 feet, falling, flipping. Again, this thing's huge. That just the booster or just the upper stage of this is like 50 meters tall. So it's 150. Well, it's like 45 meters, about 50 meters tall, about 165 feet tall, 9 meters wide, so 30 feet wide. It weighs, something like, God, I don't remember if it's something like 120 metric tons, so 120,000 kilograms. 250,000 pounds empty, and it's doing this flip maneuver, and it has to do all this perfectly. So the first four attempts of this were pretty spectacular failures.
So just to clarify, which stage is doing this maneuver?
It's the upper stage is doing this belly flop maneuver. Yep.
So this is the stage that would presumably have humans on board if it were to use.
And if things continue to plan. Now, here's something I would love to see.
Yeah.
Just saying this.
Yeah.
If you already have these big aero surfaces, the flaps, they also have to move. They're on heavy motors and hinges and flaps and all that stuff. I'm actually surprised that for Earth, they aren't just looking at landing it horizontally on a runway like the space shuttle.
Ooh.
I mean,
Interesting.
That worked. The Braun did it. The Soviet Union's Braun. I rolled my R real hard there. Sorry.
Thank you. Wow.
Really getting spicy.
I'm very impressed.
And the Braun did it. We have other space planes like the X-37B. We have the upcoming Sierra Nevada's Dream Chaser. You have some extra mass in the wings, but so does Starship. Starship has the extra mass of those flaps and, the motors and the hinges and all that stuff. I would like to see the trade on, like, is it actually lighter weight to do that versus doing what SpaceX is doing? So, that's the funny thing. I think realistically, if Elon walks in the door tomorrow and says, guys, we did some simulations and actually it's like, we can get another 5,000 kilograms into space if we just land it horizontal. If we kind of give up on our ego and land horizontally, at least on Earth, then, I think they could be doing that pretty quickly. Because that's the thing is, this ultimate thing has been to land on Mars and, other planets. And Mars doesn't have a runway, doesn't have a thick enough atmosphere to utilize aerodynamic flight like that. So you have to do propulsive landing for Mars. You're going to land on an unprepared surface, so it has to be able to do this at some point. The ultimate, it sounds ridiculous, and it is, but the ultimate goal of it is to land on Mars.
There's not much of an atmosphere to to help you with for the belly flop to be useful.
There's only 1% the atmosphere on Mars as there is on Earth, but you still want to utilize as much of that atmosphere as possible. So in the upper atmosphere, it's still going to be coming in more or less kind of perpendicular to the airstream. I guess it's probably more like, 60 degrees, 70 degrees to the airstream, like where it's belly flopping. And it's going to especially do that on Mars. It's going to need to, use up let the little bit of atmosphere there is, you're coming in at insane velocities. And so even that 1% thin atmosphere is still going to do a lot of work. Now, on Mars, there's only 38% of Earth's gravity on Mars. So the belly flop maneuver is it could be a lot more conservative. You could do that at like 5,000 feet up, and it just wouldn't matter as much because there's not as much gravity loss or gravity drag. So you can kind of just more slowly, gently, you don't have to do this crazy, extravagant, like belly flop, flip maneuver. But it would still something at some point you would transition from more or less perpendicular to the airstream to, and horizontal to landing vertically.
I like how we're having this old, boring conversation about the differences of landing on Earth versus on Mars. This is surreal that this is actually a real conversation. Well, this is something that we're discussing.
Yeah.
Because it has to do both.
Yeah. But in my opinion,
yes, I
think we'll pretty quickly see an evolution of Starship that's like dedicated versions for certain tasks.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, again, if someone runs a simulation and says it's actually more efficient and it's better just to land horizontally on a runway, then that's what's going to happen. It doesn't matter, but they still will develop. If the ultimate goal is to land on Mars, then they'll have a dedicated Mars variant, which will likely look different than the Earth variant, and they'll still probably be launched on the same booster. You know what I mean? So there's...
Oh, you mean like that particular vehicle will not be returning back to Earth. It'll need to be modified. Because the ultimate is to have one Starship that goes to Mars, lands on Mars, and takes off of Mars, lands back on Earth, and is reused again.
Yeah.
Over and over and over.
And there's a chance that you have just a cycler, just if you at the end of the day, you're just really trying to see what is most feasible, what's the most efficient. You literally have a vehicle dedicated to Mars. Mars, it's easy to do a single staged orbit. Mm-hmm. It's a lot lower gravity, a lot thinner atmosphere. You can easily do a single staged orbit. You get into orbit, you park to a dedicated, transfer vehicle that goes between Earth and Mars. It only stays in space. You don't have heat shields. You don't have landing legs. You don't have all these things that you need. And ideally, it's nuclear powered, so it's super efficient. Mm-hmm. That gets you back to Earth. Once you're at Earth, you rendezvous again with another landing Starship. And that Starship might be a horizontal runway Starship, There's no, I don't see and I think ultimately it'll win out where we don't have a one size fits all. I think that's the flaw of the space shuttle, really, is that it was trying to do everything and ended up kind of doing nothing well. But that's, I think, what SpaceX has proven. I mean, SpaceX already has variants coming. There's already going to be a dedicated lunar lander for NASA for the Artemis program. There's already going to be a tanker variant. There's already going to be likely just a pure cargo version. There's likely going to be a human version. We'll likely see evolutions of this thing happen, relatively quickly.
And once it's all working, it's only a matter of weeks before people riding on it will be complaining about the speed of the Wi-Fi. As the old Louis C.K. joke with you're flying on a chair through the air.
Yes.
It's incredible.
You didn't even know this existed, and now you're complaining about it.
It's great.
Exactly.
So you tweeted, fun fact about Starship, by doing the flip around 500 meters versus higher up, 2,000 meters, the difference in delta V is 500 meters per second. That's a 20-ton fuel saving, which means basically 20 tons more you can put into orbit. That's more than Falcon 9 has ever launched just by flipping later. That's really interesting. So that was a decision too, to flip close to the ground.
Yeah. The closer to the ground, the better. The more the atmosphere is doing work. And, we get into that video really dives into gravity losses and gravity drag. The more time you're spent, every second that your rocket engine is running, Earth is stealing 9.8 meters per second of acceleration against you. Mm-hmm. There's just inherently 9.8 meters per second squared of acceleration. So every second that engine is running, the first big majority of your thrust is actually being just stolen by Earth's gravity well. So the longer you're fighting that, the more inefficient it is. So the best thing would be you flip at 100 meters off the ground, you light all your engines to maximum thrust, and you pull 50 Gs, mm-hmm. and you land on a dime, basically. Obviously, there's no margin there. There's, and there's diminishing returns on that gravity loss thing and in your high thrust weight ratios. So that's a pretty good compromise. Yes, it looks scary, but they could be a lot more aggressive with that yet and squeeze out even a little bit better performance, but there are diminishing returns. So that's kind of the magic number we've seen so far today, but we'll likely see that, be played with.
You've attended some of these. What does it feel like to see Starship in person? First of all, when it's just sitting there stacked. And second of all, when it's doing some of these tests, some of these maneuvers.
Well, first off, if you have the freedom of traveling and happen to live within a reasonable, either by plane or car, it's worth going down to South Texas. So Starbase is right on the border of Mexico and the United States, and the very southern tip of Texas, right along the Rio Grande. And it's insane because it's right along a public highway. You can anyone can drive down this, assuming it's not closed for testing, because they do close the highways during the week a decent amount while they're doing tests. But sans any of those days, anyone can just drive down and see these things up close and personal with their own eyes. We're talking, from 100, 200 meters away, so 2 football fields away from the world's biggest, most powerful rocket. Imagine being able to do that during the, Soviet Union and, during the N1 and the Saturn V, imagine just being able to drive up right next to the launch pad. There's no way, and so to have this kind of access to this program is so incredible. The craziest thing is when you're driving out on on Highway 4, bumpy. It's riddled with potholes now because of all the insane amount of trucks having to go out there and traffic, and you're going through this. It's just this weird. You're like, where am I? You occasionally are seeing, like, you can kind of see you can see Mexico out your right window as you're driving down this highway, and you're just sitting there like, where am I? And then all of a sudden you kind of turn this corner and the trees and the brush kind of clear out, and all of a sudden you get a sense of everything on the horizon. And at that point, you're pretty much 5 miles on the nose or 8 kilometers away. And from there, you can just see through the heat haze, through the atmospheric distortion, and you just see this weird, like, it looks like a city almost on the horizon. There's tons of these tall buildings. There's a weird, ominous launch tower thing with arms wide open, and sometimes, and a giant metal rocket, and it just looks so weird. I mean, it's the word surreal. I think by definition, I think if you are expecting it, it's not surreal. I think surreal kind of means like unexpected surprise or whatever. Even if you're expecting it, even if you've seen pictures, even if everything, it is surreal.
Yeah.
You stand there and you just go, what is this?
And also, I mean, there's a kind of magical aspect to this is the place where over the next few years we'll start as a human species reaching out there, traveling out there.
We'll for sure see the development of the rockets that I think will take us further than ever before. Be born right there.
What's it like to witness the actual testing of Starship?
So far, it's been high stakes. Like, it's been insane because those the first, I kind of mentioned earlier, there's been SN8, 9, 10, 11, and 15 that have all done these suborbital hops. The highest one went 12.5 kilometers, and the rest of the 4 went 10 kilometers in altitude, and then turned off the engines and just fell. Mm-hmm. Now, the cool thing about that is the general public could be about five miles away. So again, like 8 kilometers away. And the weird thing is this rocket's slowly accelerating. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to exceed a certain speed, so they didn't have to worry about the aerodynamics of it. They just slowly climbed, and it probably also to appease the FAA. They're like, here, we'll just limit the thrust to weight ratio and just, make it so it's slow and controlled, no big deal. So it's basically more or less like slightly above a hover, just climbing for minutes, for like 4 or 5 minutes. You just hear and feel the roar of this thing. Normal rockets, like after the first 30 seconds or minute, they're so far away that it's just diminishing. It's just fading. You still get that rumble, that sense. But those first 5 flights, the suborbital hops, were just, I'll cherish them forever, because you're watching this thing that you've driven up next to. You've seen it with your own eyes. That's bigger than most buildings in a, fairly dense urban area. It's this massive thing. You stood there, you look at it, you're like, wow, that's crazy. You've seen people working on it. They're little ants compared to it. Mm-hmm. Then you drive away and you see it on the horizon, and all of a sudden that thing leaves. It starts moving.
Hovering.
Essentially. And the first time, I mean, for me at least, I put my hands on my head when I can't help it. Not so, I don't know
it's
what
surreal,
it is.
like you said.
I don't know what in human nature decides this is what to do when you can't believe something, but that's what happens. And when that thing first took off, it was just like my brain couldn't process seeing, because I had spent so much time driving around and seeing it, and all of a sudden you're watching it just take off, and you're like, it's moving. And all these, the most complicated rocket engines ever made are all firing simultaneously, and it didn't blow up on the launch pad, and it's slowly increasing, and it's just crazy. And the sound, everything about it. And so by the time the first one is specifically, it was December 2020 was the first SN8. It went up, and we all lost it in the sky. We couldn't quite see it, but we had telescopes and high telephoto lenses tracking it. And what's funny is there's a pretty strong wind up there at altitude, and it was moving. There's a lot of gaseous oxygen being vented out of the rocket, and it's being blown by this air. So it looks like it's moving actually quite quickly, like away from us, like it was strafing to one side. So I'm watching the monitor. I'm going, oh my God, they're moving it like over Brownsville. And we're all of us, everyone on this hotel balcony is looking out, down, like way out over, and we can't find it. And we're like, where did they lose it? Like, we're thinking like, oh my God, this is going to crash down in Brownsville. Yeah. And And finally, they shut the engines off and we're watching it fall. And again, we're tracking it. We know it's falling. And it's falling. It's falling super controlled. And we're like, oh my God, this is perfect. And all of a sudden it clicked and I see it with my, my eyes. I finally like tracked it. And it's straight out, like straight in front of us. And it looks like it was a blimp just barely moving. Because it is falling slowly thanks to all of its drag. And again, that's one of those moments I'm like, it's falling so slow, because it's so big, it's so massive, it's falling sideways. I've seen Falcon 9 boosters and Falcon Heavy boosters, and they scream. They come in so fast. And you can barely even see them. You can just barely track them. And all of a sudden, they light their engines, and they decelerate so quickly. This was like the opposite. It was like, is that thing ever coming down? It was just falling so slowly and so right there. Just felt like it was so close. And so when it finally lit its engine and it flipped, I was losing my mind because I'm like, it's working. This crazy plan, this huge, massive thing is doing this absurd feat. And the first four, again, didn't work out as planned. But getting to that point already, getting to that flip maneuver was a huge milestone. And it was so exciting. Just going through those firsts were amazing. And I think, we're coming up now on them doing the full stacks of the booster and the upper stage. I think when we see that fly, when that leaves Earth for the first time, it'll be, like I said, almost twice the amount of thrust as anything else. It'll be the biggest, heaviest, largest thing to ever fly. It's going to shake everything. I can't wait.
Have all 33 Raptor engines been active at once? Have they tested that?
No, that's coming up. That's kind of the next milestone. I don't know, when this will come out, but that's like the next.
Just a few days, very quickly here.
But if people listening to this, if they're listening to it early on, they'll likely be able to catch. I think at this point it seems like next week.
So step one would be static fire.
Yep, holding onto the rocket and lighting up the engines. And so far they've lit at most. They went for like a more than 14 engine static fire. I don't recall if it was like 16 or something engines lit at once, and they ended up going down to 14 engines. That's the most engines they've ever lit. So the next step and the final kind of step before they fly this thing is they're actually going to light all 33 engines simultaneously. And although that sounds scary, let's not forget the Falcon Heavy that's now flown 5 times completely flawlessly has 27 engines running simultaneously. So they definitely have, SpaceX has experience with high number of engines running at the same time, but it is still like, this is going to be a lot of moving parts and a lot of potential and a lot of everything.
What are the upcoming milestones, expected milestones? And I think there's one in particular I'd like to talk to you more about, but leading up to that, of course, is like, what are some of the tests here on the way? So is the static fire, the fully stacked with the 2 stages, will there be, and then all that leading to an orbital launch test? What are the things we should know about? And when do you think, like, what do you think the timeline will be with like the orbital test?
Timeline, the reason we have this website, the expected milestones, is because I always tell people to ignore any time you ever hear for any of this stuff and just pay attention to milestones, because when you're doing stuff for the first time, you just have no idea.
So just to understand the expected milestones here, the first column is the event, the second column is the date and status, TBD, complete. Green means what?
Green means it's been completed and it shows the completion date there.
And the completion date.
Yep.
And then the others, maybe more, maybe not, for the full stack testing, the D-stack, and there's a 33 engine.
So realistically, we're expecting them to destack, and SpaceX, I think, just tweeted that actually, that they're going to be destacking the second stage from the first stage, kind of get the ship safe while they test, because they don't want to, 33 engines is pretty high risk. If they do blow up the rocket, when they test it for the first time, it's not going to be fully fueled, I don't think, at least. But there is a limit to how they do have to have it weighed down enough that the launch clamps can hold on to it. Because if you think about it, like, normally the launch clamps are holding onto an entire rocket weighing 5 million kilograms. 5 million, it's weighing an insane amount. So those clamps don't actually have to hold 75 meganewtons of thrust. They really only have to hold down 25 meganewtons of thrust. You know what I mean? They're not designed to hold down all 75. So they do have to have enough weight on the rocket. So even when they do the testing of the 33 engines, it'll have to have enough propellant in there that they don't exceed the clamping and the holding force of the stand. Otherwise, it'll break free from the launch stand and that booster will go flying off uncontrolled.
So it's a difficult thing to figure out in the test how many simultaneous things you test, right?
So they're kind of mitigating risks, which is why like they're destack, they don't want to have, although the ship could be on top of it to help weigh it down and simulate the, the launch environment better. At some point, that's a risk they're just going to take when they go for launch. And so for now, they're taking the ship off in case something goes wrong during the 33 engine test. And then once we see if the 33 engine test goes well, hopefully we see the second stage get stacked back on it. We'll see them get closer, like closing out all the items. And hope the big one too is the FAA launch license. That'll be publicly filed. We'll see that in the system having a launch license. And I have no sense of that type of thing. That's outside of, but that is a big milestone, and it might be something that could potentially hinder, hold up the launch date. We'll just be waiting for a launch license.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of fascinating bureaucracy and politics and legal stuff and all that kind of beautiful, magical thing when you live in reality, because it is a big rocket.
Yeah. Well, and the biggest thing, it's not so much the FAA doesn't necessarily care about the success of the rocket. They really just care about the safety of public property, So it's a matter of being convinced and having the data to prove, okay, if this thing blows up, we have control of how and when it blows up. We have control of, X, Y, and Z. Here's the potential damage. Here's the blast radius. This again is over twice as powerful and twice as much potential. Actually, it's a lot more potential for an explosive energy. If it, were to happen to, well, let me walk back a little bit, because in order to have a real detonation, you have to have a perfect mixture ratio of your fuel and oxidizer. Mm-hmm. When a rocket blows up, typically, it kind of unzips and some of the fuel will mix into some of the oxidizer, and you could have some explosive energy, but a lot of it's actually just a deflagration. It's just, flames and there would be explosive energy, but it's not like you're lighting all of it simultaneously. It's this giant bomb. It's just really not. So that's good, but at the same time, even in those circumstances, the amount of energy is still absurd enough to likely blow out windows, for miles and miles and miles, including my studio space.
Well, if the cameras hold up, it will be one heck of a show. Exactly. Hopefully, of course, would not happen. So, how does that take us to an orbital launch? When do you think that would happen?
In my opinion. Yeah. This is a very fluid, and this will change literally by the hour.
So you really think that it's very difficult to really say, like, even for something that could very well happen this year, even just a few months away, making a prediction. By the way, are you like superstitious on this kind of stuff a little bit? Like, you're worried about jinxing it and that kind of stuff?
At all. No.
Because I would imagine you would be like waiting for all of these launches that keep getting delayed, or you start thinking that there's certain things you do will control the weather.
My socks. Why am I wearing these socks that just scrubbed again? Yeah.
You're lucky. You have to wear the same lucky socks, otherwise there's going to be bad weather. Yeah.
So the reason that I say this and why it's so difficult is they did a first full stack test in July of 2021, and the expectation was we're a month or two away from a launch.
Yeah.
So realistically, for 18 months, I've been in a purgatory thinking that we're a month or two away of an orbital launch. Now, I did say, for the record, when that thing stacked and when a lot of speculation was saying, a month or two, I was saying, I don't expect it to fly in 2021. And I've been just saying, I just saw the amount of work that still needed to be done, like on the ground systems, the tanks, the launch mount, all the stuff. I'm sitting there like, there's still a lot of stuff. And they're going to have to validate it. They're going to have to test everything, every component. And, people were like, how dare you say that? Even Gwen Shotwell, the president of SpaceX, is saying Q3 of 2021. I'm like, okay, but I'm not going to be surprised if it slips into 2022. And here we are at the beginning of 2023. And I think we're finally within 2 months. I'm expecting, I'm trying to keep my March and April as free as I can. We'll put it that way.